It's important to see that we do have a local effort here in the community to try to get together on a somewhat more regular basis than the annual festival in Edinburgh, which is also a really great event. I hope that we can continue to see developments with that, but we should also recognize that when people are putting effort together to have meetings or conferences or whatever it is, it's important that we can do what we can to support the community and the local interest here and these interesting subjects. So, as Lillian said, my name is Daniel Allen Jones. What I'm going to be doing for you guys today is a 3-part seminar that deals with, as she mentioned, a cultural study of ufology, not just as a study, scientific pursuit, but also a look into the community and the outlooks and the values. We'll talk about that as well. I'm going to be flying through a lot of information, so if you see something that interests you, please feel free to let me know if I pass through it. There will also be QR codes on the screen that will link to media, interviews, and other things that I've conducted that you can check out as well. So just like if you are out sky watching and looking out up into the day or night sky and you want to try to see something unusual, a UFO or whatever it might be, have your phones ready in case you see something that interests you so you can snap a picture or try to get that QR code. And then, as she mentioned as well, we'll do some Q&A. If there are anything that interests you that you want to ask or talk or let me know, if you have a story to share, something like that, to that effect, let's save that for afterwards so we can kind of keep the discussion going. There are some cool items here on these tables that you guys can check out if you have any questions about any of that. I've got some UFO-related books and literature, and we're glad to be able to debut Zeno here in the Valley. This is his first time here at an event that he can kind of get to know everybody. He's just a peaceful little guy, as you can see over there. Come get your picture with him and make contact. Let everyone know that you got to meet him and make contact with Zeno. So this event is exploring encounters, and I'm hopeful that this can be a theme that we can see continue, perhaps with a different topic, maybe something similar, but also under the guise of maybe if it's exploring encounters, a cryptozoology seminar or a paranormal seminar, and have different presenters or specialists come to talk about a number or myriad of different presentations. I think that would be really cool. Usually meetings might be a singular topic or a presentation. What we're going to do today is go through 3, kind of like shorter versions to give you an idea that you can maybe use to get further into it. And thanks to different things going on, the Texas UFO Conference is just going to be later in Jefferson in August, and the Texas UFO Network, which is another community organization. All right, so as Lillian mentioned, I am a musician. I do private music instruction, and that's primarily based where I am from in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I advocate citizen science and journalism. I think it's important to recognize that most of people in the population are not science-minded or are scientists. But we can have interests that pertain to things that we can look into inquisitively and also pursue with scientific things in mind to help us do what we can as citizens to help develop these areas of interest. I'm also interested in anthropology, archaeology, and other things like history, nature, and wildlife. So it's something that I think we can all do what we are able to in our own ways to get involved with and share our passions together, and also do what we can to connect the community to other resources. As I mentioned, I'm in a band, so there we are touring all over the galaxy. They dropped me off here this weekend. That was actually at Del Rio years ago, which was a lot of fun. So I'm not just interested in UFOs. I like all kinds of different unexplained things and interesting scientific topics of inquiry. Spectrology or phantasmology is like a fancy way of saying the paranormal. Parapsychology is interesting. Consciousness, of course, strange historical findings and historical histories. As I mentioned earlier, cryptozoology. UFOlogy, of course, which is what today's primary subject will be about. And xenology, which is something that we don't hear a lot about, but we'll get into that later on as our last portion. Today is going to be about ufology ethnography. Some of you might have heard of ufology, but ethnography is something that I always find many people don't know what that word means. We'll talk a little bit about that. Well, what is ufology? It's a study. It's more than just a study. We've got a lot of things to kind of get into, but what I'll just mention is, of course, it just means unidentified. UFO does not mean alien spaceship. We often conflate those two ideas together, but it's important to know that this topic has a lot of tangential aspects that get into other areas of interest, aliens being one of them, and that's okay. but it's important to not really immediately jump the gun and just to insinuate that UFOs automatically means aliens, right? There are a lot of things that people see that they don't know what they are. So it's a subjective term. We all interpret things differently. And I think one of the interesting things about what we're looking at is that people have a different perception depending on anything, their cultural lens, their upbringing, a lot to it, right? So UFOs generally refer to a lot of these different ideas, and you even have things like USOs in the water. Transmedium objects is when it goes from one medium, like water or underwater, to the sky, or maybe even into space. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on. Obviously, the official nomenclature these days is unidentified anomalous phenomena, which could mean anything, right? It was aerial, they changed that. And so there's a lot of interesting things. We also deal with trying to understand what data can be gleaned and evidence can be used to try to help build strong cases. We also would be naive to think that there are no hoaxes, and that does happen, unfortunately. We have to acknowledge that sometimes that muddies up the waters. There are genuine people interested in the seriousness, and then there are those who are charlatans who just try to capitalize on gullibility and naivety. So it's important to acknowledge that as a community. That's something we have to make sure we recognize as well. And there are genuine unknowns. We just don't know. We don't know if it means alien or what, but it's important to see. So the other topics that this subject gets into, as many of you already know, of course, the basis for space and astronomy and cosmology. It's a great gateway into those areas of interest. We also talk about aliens and extraterrestrial life, non-human intelligence, things like abductions, contact. It also touches base into more historic mysteries like ancient astronaut theory, as you see on the show, Ancient Aliens. And the ideas that are really prevalent now or in recent times with government, this thing about disclosure, how and what role does the military play, and perhaps science, technology, and what engineering capabilities might be found with some of the interesting things happening, as well as some of the other mysterious topics. But not only is ufology a study, but it's a culture, and it's really important. You can think of it as a culture, a subculture. There are many aspects that we can look into to help us understand the outlooks, the views. So, who's seeing UFOs? Anywhere from ordinary citizens to people of any accolade. So you have notable figures, you have surface level enthusiasts, you have serious researchers, academics, government officials, people who inadvertently are brought into this topic because of an experience, who otherwise didn't know what this was or didn't want anything to do with it. But you have all these different things, groups, places. There is so much to it that I think it's a treasure trove of an opportunity to take a very serious academic approach in looking at not just the phenomena. As interested as I am in the many different types of phenomena, I'm equally as interested in the community and the culture surrounding those involved with these things as well. All right, so who knows what an ethnography is, or who's never heard of this word before? So cool, ethnography is essentially a cultural study, and that's what an ethnographer produces, or a cultural anthropologist. Now, many people can interpret this in different ways, but I think it's important to note that, like, I, as a person involved with this field for over a decade, am fascinated as someone who becomes involved, looks at what the different outlooks are, and understands them the best I can, without having to necessarily pick and choose sides or just have this idea that this is the only explanation or my belief is the only one or whatever it is. And I think it's important to be able to see how, as a cultural study, we can use it as a comparative analysis with other cultural ideas, values, and in the greater whole of society, what role it plays in further development in different parts of our world. And so many different things help us to see that you can learn about the viewpoints, the different people involved, like notable figures or places, and what kind of resources can help us stay connected, like events like this. Flying through a lot of this information here, I'm just going to make it very brief, but the way I conduct my involvement with any of this through research is going to be both qualitative and quantitative, and then you have things that bring me to places like here in the Valley because of things thanks to Noe, who's written about the Edinburgh UFO, and others who have helped to generate interest in this particular topic to provide there to be like the basis for an event. We go to the Edinburgh UFO Festival and Conference because of a historic instance that happened here in 1966. We'll get into that later on. But because of places that you can go to, people that you can talk to, the ones that have actually put the time into trying to understand this subject, it's really good to see that these things are available both in person and online through literature, through archives, through organizations, So I've done what I can to actively participate in these different settings, while also making my own contributions and providing content management and community organizations to be able to help with a framework for this. So what are UFOs? Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, they just are unknown objects. They aren't any particular thing. They are all subjective things depending on how we interpret them. But what can we look at historically that helps us get an idea about what UFOs are supposed to be or how we can understand them? Well, if we look back at Ohio professor of astronomy, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who got brought into the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which is a UFO investigation program. He was used to help dissuade the public, to allay any fears that UFOs were threatening, and was the one who came up with the term swamp gas, which has now become sort of a trope, right? And unfortunately, it's something that people get upset to think about how it was used as a way to dissuade the seriousness of the topic. Despite that, he actually continued on, realizing there is a real interest in reality to the UFO phenomenon, and he founded the Center for UFO Studies. And he also produced what we call the Hynek scale. He was a consultant on the movie, Spielberg movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And while he's no longer alive, his family, such as his son, Paul Hynek, who I've met and worked with, helped to share about the Hynek legacy. I was fortunate enough last year, literally right after the Edinburgh Festival, to drive all the way back and meet up with Paul and his family. And some of his family lives in the DFW area. We went up to Clarksville, Texas, and watched the solar eclipse. Very cool to actually be able to spend an astronomical event with an astronomical family. There are all the Hynek children out in Clarksville, Texas, who are watching the solar eclipse. Very cool opportunity. I'm glad I got to do that. Well, back to this idea of why Hynek is important and our understanding of UFOs. The Hynek scale deals with what we call the close encounters, or close encounter scale. First, second, and third, essentially what we have as a primary way to gauge what a UFO sighting is. The first kind is essentially seeing an object. The second kind is something or someone being affected physically by that unknown object. And the third is someone or people witnessing, occupants, or anything that's tangential to the object itself that might be like our buddy Zeno or Cosmo over here. And so the close encounters of the third kind is where you don't just have an object, but you have entities or occupants within the vicinity or with the object itself. Later, people have added and expanded upon it to include the close encounters of the fourth kind and fifth kind. Fourth, it would be abductions, and fifth is what we call human-initiated contact, like people trying to do what they can to interface with non-human intelligence or aliens or whatever you perceive them to be, and people will continue, I'm sure, to add on to that. Those were really added later, not by Hynek. What data is there, right? Some people say, well, this is all just pseudoscience, it's not real, I don't believe in UFOs. A lot of that's a misnomer. Like, to say that we don't believe in UFOs, it doesn't make sense, because people see things, whether they're in the sky or not, that they just don't know, right? So there are ways to measure statistically what we're finding out, and there is hard evidence, hard data, like radar. And tracking on radar can be useful in a lot of ways, but it's not just that. You have other things, eyewitness testimony, and you have physical effects, and all these ideas of what we can use to create a huge data set from these points to show that there are correlations, there are geographical significance, and where some things are happening, and there's a lot to collecting data on UFOs. Well, who is researching UFOs and trying to collect this data? Fortunately, people like my good friend, the late great Jim Marrs, was someone who took had the courage to look into some of the challenging journalistic topics that not a lot of people were willing to do. He wrote a book called Alien Agenda to survey just that, to see what is the alien agenda. It was one of the best-selling books on UFOs, non-fiction books in the world. He passed away a number of years ago, but thanks to him, he had a big part to play in helping me get involved with any of this stuff, and I'd like to do what I can to help honor his life and legacy. So I just want to give an honorable mention to my buddy Jim Marrs for helping to pave the way, not just for me, but for a lot of people who are interested in this topic and taking a serious look at it. He also introduced me to people like Linda Moulton Howe, who's also an investigative journalist, covered many things from UFO sightings, crashes, animal mutilations, to whistleblowers, and I met her a number of years in an event called the Secret Space Program Conference. People like Michael Schratt, stealth aviation historians, who look into what is the reality behind the object seen from a standpoint that the military government has some of these, or that there are genuine non-human technologies. He's done a lot of really interesting work to try to artistically render some of the most notable crash cases out there. Richard Dolan has looked at this extensively from a national security standpoint, considered what kind of efforts are made by potential breakaway civilizations, and he hosted an open dialogue with a platform he uses called Intelligent Disclosure. Christopher, rest in peace. He was here in 2022 as a speaker at the Edinburgh Festival. He had the UFO data acquisition project. It's hard to see what's going to happen with that now that he's gone, but it's important to know that there are still things that are good to know about things, groups, people, even if they've passed, that we can still look into and utilize. So thanks to him, we can do what we can. People like David Marler with the National UFO Historical Records Center, and I think it's actually Rio Rancho near Albuquerque. But he's done a tremendous job, probably the largest archive of UFO material in the world. And that's really important to keep in mind that we have that. We have people who are taking the time to make sure that this is available for us. Well, who claims to have encounters? There's stories all over the world of people encountering some otherworldly, inordinary, or non-human type entity, or creature, alien, whatever you want to call them. Here Jim is holding up a copy of a newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, from 1897, that talks about several what they call airship stories, but most notably one in Aurora, Texas, not too far from where I am, that talks about the legend of a spaceship crashed here in 1897 and the pilot who was killed was buried here. Well, this is highly contested even after 100 years, but it just goes to show that science fiction was in its infancy the next year, 1898, War of the Worlds came out, and this was about a Martian invasion. So to suggest that we only have had science fiction for the last few decades is not true, and we can see that the influence that media has, multimedia, even before the advent of the internet, shows us that these ideas have been with us for a long time, and the tropes like little green men are not recent. The earliest trope or use of little green men in association with extraterrestrials, I tracked down to like 1906 in old newspapers, and then several times after that. Before it was often relegated to like fae, fairy, and folklore type things. Flying along here, I'm going to speed through a ton of this stuff just so we can keep track of all this. A lot of people have heard of Roswell. They hear that word and it kind of like gives us a buzz of ideas. UFOs, aliens, right? Well, in early July of 1947, this is right after where we get the term flying saucer from a man named Kenneth Arnold, who was flying over Mount Rainier in Washington, seeing what he described as 9 crescent-shaped objects, which were moving in a way that he described like saucers. That was later told to the media, which then spun it into Kenneth Arnold saw flying saucers on June 24th, 1947. And then now we have this term that we use to associate with the idea of UFOs. Flying saucer is a little bit more descriptive, right? If you saw a giant flying triangle, that might be something different than a saucer or disc-shaped craft, which are very prevalent, right? So here we have the Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on wrench, and there's subsequent articles. Now, I'm just bringing this up because it's important. Most people who know something about the subject see this picture of Jesse Marcel. Major Marcel held this material in Fort Worth, Texas, where I am, and displayed it to the world because of a press conference and a media stunt that just showed us that this was material gathered allegedly from the crash field at the debris site north of Roswell near Corona, New Mexico. And I was able to find his grave from where he's from in Houma in Louisiana. And it's interesting that he passed away on the same day that Kenneth Arnold had his sighting. Interesting. But yeah, so people often wonder about this. Many years later, he told Stanton Friedman that what he saw out there on that ranch was, and he took with him and showed to his family, he said it was not made by humans. It was not made by people in this world. And of course, that wasn't until the 70s and many years later, which people had wondered. So this Roswell story was dormant for many years. People don't realize that. But now there's a legacy of Roswell information and researchers. Many of these people are regularly involved with the annual Roswell Festival and the panels and the disseminating of information in a way that helps us understand that even after 3/4 of a century, people are still adamant to do what they can to get to the bottom of it. And thanks to people like Noe, who's been involved with the orchestration of the festival in many ways over the years, we see it's a long-running event. And we need to be able to see that we can do what we're able to keep things like that, and these guys' legacies as well, keep that going for future generations. I was also fortunate to write an article for the paper of the same, publishing on not UFOs, but signs in the search for extraterrestrials that dealt with the modern efforts towards doing what we can to understand the reality of extraterrestrial life out in space, specifically for things like SETI and the Galileo project. So I interviewed some of those scientists for that. Moving on, a lot of other people do have claims to which they have subsequently been affected by their coming out of saying that they have had an encounter. Betty and Barney Hill in 1961 claimed to have been abducted and have subsequently interesting things happen during hypnotic regression, through which they recalled things. Betty had a star chart and was able to understand that it was to be Zeta Reticuli, and this is where they're from. A lot of really interesting things. They're no longer alive, but their niece, Kathleen Martin, is, and she talks about she continues their legacy. She's part of MUFON as well, and the Experiencer Resource Team, and I think it's important to see that we can continue that work as well. People like Calvin Parker, who we were fortunate to have come here to Edinburgh, and he unfortunately passed away recently. So this just goes to show that, not to remind everyone of how temporal things are, but without doing what we can, this stuff gets lost and forgotten forever. So, thanks to people like Calvin, who was the younger of the two gentlemen that had an encounter in 1973 in Pascagoula, Mississippi, in which they saw a strange object come down and entities descend out of it, take them aboard a craft, and put them on some kind of medical examination table. Had tremendous experience. He talks all about this in his book that he produced and the interviews that he'd done. So he lived for quite a while. The other man, Charles Hickson, wasn't around for way too long, but did share the same story. And this is something that people consider a very serious, real case. Of course, probably one of the most, if not the most notable so-called abduction case is Travis Walton. So Travis claims that in 1975, from November 5th through the 10th, that he was missing and taken. He and the logging crew he was working with in Heber, or near Snowflake, Arizona, in the Sitgreaves National Forest, basically witnessed what they described as a fire in the sky. They saw this object as they went, they got closer, they went really very close to it apparently, and it mesmerized them. Travis was so compelled that he got out of the truck, ran up to it, and an arc of light, or beam of light, shot out, struck him. All of the construction workers thought he was dead. They drove away. Mustered up the courage to come back to find that he was missing. They went to the sheriff's department. They told the law enforcement, who they were able to see that they were visibly shaken by this. And then Travis appears 5 days later, describing having been taken aboard, being put on somewhat of a medical table, and seeing small gray entities like our buddies Zeno and Cosmo here, and making his way through some kind of corridor and other places like a hangar or this part of the craft and that part, and describes other beings, human-like beings. This was also made into a movie called Fire in the Sky. How many of you guys have seen that movie before? Every time that comes up, people will say that movie traumatized me. Well, it's dramatized, but that's the purpose of Hollywood. It gets more people's attention than probably a lot of things, but it lets people know that sometimes there could be reality to what's embedded in fiction. Well, I've been out to the location. I found the place where it happened, and I found the phone booths. Travis actually used to host an event called the Skyfire Summit. I know he was a part of that as well. I don't think he's been doing that lately, but we've been to the location, and it's inaccessible. I made it out there in my Honda Civic at the time, so I was probably out in the middle of the woods. People like Terry Lovelace, a few years later in '77, described having seen a triangular object with his military buddy out in Devil's Den, Arkansas, and were badly irradiated and considered that they were also abducted. He came out much more recently, only in the last few years, and has been considered kind of a credible person, and has also considered that he has implants that have come and gone as well. Another very notable case that people claim to have in the 80s, in 1980 specifically in December, was in Suffolk, England, the Royal Air Force Base, and you can see a number of people here. Basically, the Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt, who was a speaker here, along with, at some point, Nick Pope, claims to be part of the Ministry of Defense's UFO investigation program. Well, he says it's the most notable, the UK's #1 UFO case. Charles Hall claims to have seen the object. James Penniston and Jonathan Burroughs were actually sent out into Rendlesham Forest to investigate seeing the object on the ground in a tripodal fashion. And James Penniston actually went up and claims to have touched the object and received a download of binary code. Subsequently, or at least on the contrary, John claims to have been affected and was radiated. He was not able to receive medical treatment, apparently, for many years because they were unable to determine the origins of the radiation until the late Senator John McCain released and revealed that it was due to UAP, which de facto revealed that it was because of an unidentified phenomenon. Oh, there we go. All right, so 97, Phoenix, Arizona. We have the Phoenix Lights incident. So in Phoenix, a city full of people of all kinds witnessed an enormous, like completely disproportionately large object in the sky, or what seems to be multiple lights that perhaps were in the configuration of a unified point. Here, Dr. Lynn Katai, who did come here a few years back, presented on being a witness in her documentary to the Phoenix Lights from March in 1997. And people subsequently have come forward after the fact later on and said, I saw it too. One of them being, they held a press conference where the governor came out and said, this is a real thing, and then they had someone in an alien costume come out. Does anyone remember that event where they had a press conference and someone in an alien suit came out and they all kind of laughed it off? Well, they downplayed it, or at least the impression was people thought it was downplayed, but the reality was that the governor himself, Fife Symington, actually said, well, yeah, I saw it too. This isn't a silly thing. This is a reality was that he saw it, but he didn't really mean for that to be a silly thing with the costume. It was just kind of a spontaneous thing, I suppose. But nevertheless, people like Dr. Lynn Katai and Kurt Russell, Hollywood celebrity and fame, has come out and said, I was a pilot. He was flying in the sky when we saw that. So there could be something to the Phoenix Lights. And of course, people wonder about experiencers. I've met Chris Bledsoe, who talks about things that he is able to bring into perspective with orbs. Some people say summoning orbs. Some people would say that that's pejorative, actually, and kind of derogatory to suggest summoning, but more or less that he's able to call these objects of light, and he refers to as being in communication with what he says is the lady. So this isn't just someone saying this. There are several intelligence community officers and officials who are very interested and invested in this individual, and have been for years apparently. So very interesting situation. And moving on to what role do UFOs play in the media? All right, so I was fortunate to interview Leslie Kane, writer for the New York Times, and because of people like her, a lot of this information and interest started as a resurgence in 2017. At the end of 2017, the New York Times released an article about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, revealing a hidden program that looked into UFOs within the Pentagon. This was also about Lou Elizondo, and so because of this, there's a lot of people who are now interested in this subject over the last 8 years or so. But what else in media? Well, it's not like this was just something that started in 2017. There's been a lot of media, whether it's network television, literature, the internet, printed materials, all kinds of stuff. It's been around for a long time. How many of you guys remember that show, UFO Hunters, from the History Channel? Had a few seasons. I got to work with Pat Uskert for a number of years, or at least a little while, back when he was done with the show. And I met Bill Burns much more recently, and he doesn't do a lot anymore, but he was at an Alien Con event. And this got a lot of people interested in the subject because the History Channel gets millions of viewers, so they also have Ancient Aliens. So I've met Giorgio Tsoukalos, who's the producer for Ancient Aliens. He's also a world traveler, and a lot of people just think of him as this meme. He's a living meme, the aliens guy, right? Really interesting individual. And I think that, he realizes his sensationalism, but he also is understanding that it's something that he can utilize as a way to captivate interest and inspire people to be open-minded, to consider the possibilities. That show is like the #1 History Channel syndicated program. There's something like 20 seasons, you know? And I've been fortunate to talk with Eric von Däniken, who's kind of sort of the founding father of what we call ancient astronaut theory. And he would say himself, and I have several of his books over here, he lists his material and the content of his books as questions. Many people think he's stating facts, and maybe in some way it's all semantics, but that's one of the things he says, is he's asking questions. And I've gotten to talk with him on a number of occasions as well. And other people like David Hatcher Childress, who has been a speaker here at the Edinburgh Festival and Conference, talk about this, but also look at it as a possibility that there's alternative technologies, parallel developments in ancient civilizations, and that maybe it's not all aliens, but it could be that there's more to it. So a lot to that. There's so many other people from the show and those things that I didn't include, but who has UFOs? Well, Zeno's got one down here, but we got to keep that in wraps for now. But there are other places and people that are really under the impression that there are groups, places, governments harboring these materials. And I'll just say that while I haven't met him myself, someone was asking me earlier what I think about Bob Lazar. Well, I interviewed George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. George Knapp is the reason anyone knows about Area 51 in the way that we do, because he interviewed Bob Lazar back in 1989, who basically opened the whole discussion up about there being a facility that we refer to as such, which is a plot of land. The facility itself is Edwards Air Force Base Detachment 3. Bob Lazar claims that there is something called S4, or Section, or Sector 4, and other people claim there are S1, 2, 3, 4, whatever there is. And these are all very highly compartmentalized areas of development pertaining to alien reproduction vehicles, or ARV. So there's a lot of discrepancy, a lot of conjecture about these things, a lot of things about his claims that people are curious about the veracity of, and so it's important to be skeptical, not just disregarding, but curious. That's how I look at it, and I think it's important to be open-minded that there are people who corroborate his claims, there are people who think that people like this are just liars. So it's important to do what we can to get to the source of it, so I was glad to be able to talk with them. And go there myself, at least as far as I could, without getting past these signs. So I've been there on a number of occasions now, and it's just one of these tourist destinations at this point. It's the most popular top secret base in the world. People talk about Dulce Base, this idea that there's an underground facility in Dulce, New Mexico, by the New Mexico-Colorado border, that houses several different levels of humans, human aliens, scientists, research projects. Many people, even John Lear, the Learjet legacy, have talked about this, and there are many people who attest to this being very challenging to the reality that maybe something's going on. I would just say that having met and spoken with Greg Valdez, who's law enforcement there, son of his father Gabe Valdez, who was also law enforcement for many years in Dulce, New Mexico, basically say that everything you hear about this story about the Dulce base and the underground facilities, the firefights, Phil Schneider's stories, it's all very sensational and totally baseless. I don't know myself, but that's just what this guy says, is that anything you hear about Dulce Base is all made up. This idea that people were killed and there's aliens there and everything. Now I don't know, but it's interesting to hear that there are some contrary views. Of course, a lot of people have been talking about Skinwalker Ranch. This is just one of those places that has a TV show that gets millions of viewers. So the viewership affects society by way of entertainment. But Brand Bugle, the owner, is serious in investing like a real scientific effort, it seems, to try to share with the public. So people wonder about other hotspots that don't have TV shows that similar activity might be happening. And of course, this fun idea that maybe there are facilities around the world, deep underground military bases, or DUMBs, that might have or harbor some kind of interesting technology that's not parallel to that what we have here in the public and what's commercially available. So even Denver played into this conspiracy idea, this conspiracy theory that Denver Airport has this massive installation. They had this whole art exhibit with things that talked about aliens and reptilians and the Illuminati and lizard people, as you can see here. It's kind of fun. I don't think that's still up there though, but they played right into it. And who knows, they maybe could have something and no one would really know. But it just should insinuate it's more than just technology. It's more than just having materials and labs that no one can really talk about. If there are entities, if there are beings, if there are little people like this, diminutive gray humanoids that we call aliens, whatever these things actually are, people consider many different ways to interpret them. If they're even organic or if they're inorganic, cyborgs, androids, all kinds of things. But the reality is that since we don't have a factual base of knowledge in society, in academia, it's all free-for-all until it isn't, right? And I think that even when things are established, people will still interpret things their own way. But if anyone is actually housing something to this effect, then it changes everything if that information can get out. And if you've been following along with Congress, there are people, so-called whistleblowers, who are espousing that this is the reality that we live in and that there are groups that are in possession of non-human technology and non-human biologics. So you can go check this little display out in the Roswell Museum, where they have all kind of fun stuff too. So what does government have to do with UFOs? And if there are facilities around the world that have this stuff, I mean, that would be a place to start. People often wonder, what about these ideas of Men in Black? Is it just a fun movie? Well, yeah, but also, people have been threatened and intimidated by strange personnel, whether they are in government or not. They are at least masquerading as such. So, my buddy Nick Redfern, he's written extensively about these Men in Black accounts. And there are also women in black, too. There's Zeno, of course, being as peaceful as ever, but, can't help himself whenever he's just out in public. So, it's one of those things that we have to see that subsequent to people having an encounter, sometimes they're followed up with government interest because maybe they're trying to keep track of what's happening. Nick Pope, again, he claims to have worked for the Ministry of Defense and the UFO department, but he's, if not anything else, a spokesperson for the topic on several media platforms, and of course is very well known. He's been to the Edinburgh event several times. People often also wonder about Dr. Travis Taylor and Jay Stratton, who worked with the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, which has been modified to fit like the current structure of things. These are very serious people who are involved with this in a way that can, I think, lend some credence to this, that there is a serious interest on behalf of the government and defense contractors in the intelligence community. People like Tim Burchett, and again, I share this not to advocate any particular political ideology. What's really important is that when this is presented in Congress, it's bipartisan, which is great, but it doesn't mean that by sharing anything that I'm insinuating that this is the viewpoint you need to subscribe to. So even someone like him, they're interested in getting to the bottom of this. He's been involved with the past 2 congressional hearings and the closed ones as well, and they're doing what they can to provide protection for whistleblowers. Many of these people are not going to come forward in public settings. I'm sure that it costs taxpayers a pretty penny for them to hold public hearings, so many of these are probably being privately conducted. People wonder about Lou Elizondo. People wonder about his real involvement. He recently wrote a book called Imminent. I've met him on a few occasions, and I've looked into him in his background, and even I would say, I don't know. I mean, you can trust somebody all you want. You can think that they're charismatic. There's a great deal of fraternity in any social setting, but people like things that sound good to be true. And so, no offense to anyone on here, but I think it's important to remain objective in your involvement in a way that you can still hear people out and not necessarily have to believe them, agree with them, or accept what they're telling you. And Lou Elizondo is a counterintelligence officer, but now he's going around and sharing about different things that he's been involved with, and so I got to see him more recently. I think we're running almost the exact same thing like several years later. That's cool. And I am today too. So, you can check him out through his tour that he's doing right now and like all these other events going on. He's on several platforms and podcasts. Well, okay, government is one thing. What about military? Government officials tend to rotate in and out. The military is a pretty permanent basis of operation. People like Stephen Greer have talked about whistleblowers that describe all kinds of incredible things going on in the military industrial complex and the groups that are looped within that don't have any legal accountability. Whistleblowers that attest to there being programs, technologies, intelligences, all kinds of things. He's also an advocate for CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, of which which he has his own protocols. I got to interact with him through a live video call a number of years ago during a CE5 event. But he came out with this disclosure project back in 2001, bringing several people up to the National Press Club to hold a mock hearing. And now look, many years later, 20 years later, here we are having congressional hearings. On a bit of a tangent, the military has had its hand in a lot of other somewhat occult topics, one of them being parapsychology or remote viewing. I've met, I think, almost every member of the Stargate program, and this is a remote viewing program. A lot of people don't really know much about this. They've heard of things maybe like astral projection or out-of-body experiences. Controlled remote viewing is essentially a meditative process in an attempt to glean information non-locally or out of your own body. So, many people have attested to the reality of this phenomenon, and they utilize this to do espionage and for whatever they needed to seek out. And some of them did have to deal with UFOs and non-human intelligence. Paul Smith is an instructor, and John Alexander is kind of an interesting character as well, done a lot of different things, but just a point to put in there. When it comes to military, a lot of weight is put on anyone with nuclear access. Clearances, everything, right? So Robert Salas, who at the time in Montana in 1967 was involved with the nuclear facility and armaments there, which were subsequently deactivated due to a UFO coming over the base. It put the whole thing on red alert, and he has then, in more recent years, come forward. He's talked about it, he's written about it, and he, I think, had a closed hearing with Congress more recently, and did the National Press Club on Congress. He had been at some events here in Texas and is also involved in others as well. More recently, we have what we call the Tic Tac. How many of you guys have seen that Tic Tac video all over the news? It's everywhere. It's going to probably stay that way. It's terrible footage. It's a super, I think, a huge disappointment to everyone. Not because of the event itself, but because this is what we're sharing to the world, is the grainy footage of something. And people can say whatever they want about that, but they keep saying that they have all this incredible footage. Where is it, right? So anyway, I interviewed 4 of the military Navy veteran witnesses to that event off the coast of California in 2004. It wasn't revealed until much later on, right? So they're all in an interesting way connected to the event. P.J. Hughes was actually on the Nimitz aircraft carrier. The whole group is called the Nimitz Battle Group. Another vessel, a part of that group, is called the USS Princeton, which Kevin Day, Gary Voorhees, and Jason Turner were part of. And Kevin Day was the senior radar analyst, and he was looking at these objects, these what we call uncorrelated targets, going from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet in no time. So he sent up the Super Hornets, the F-18s, with the 2 people inside that got the game cam footage that we now see all over everything, right? And all of the people involved have different stories. P.J. Hughes says that on board the Nimitz, that people in aircraft personnel in blue jumpsuits came and stole, or confiscated rather, data tapes. Commander David Fravor, the pilot, says that never happened. So even within the same UFO case, you could say, you have contradictory viewpoints. Kind of challenging. But yeah, so this is a very interesting case, and they're doing what they can. They've been involved with other projects since this. But people wonder, what were those Tic Tacs? Were they really alien spaceships, or were they something a little bit more prosaic, or were they actually like an exotic propulsion technology? Were they made by some kind of corporation that someone knows? So it makes us wonder what's really going on with some of the sightings of these so-called Tic Tac shaped objects. All right, running through these, what do academics think about UFOs? Well, Dr. Michael Masters, who's a biological anthropologist, has written a book called IFOs, who considers that these are people from the future. They are us coming back and time traveling to try to understand something that we're doing based upon timelines or whatever it could be. So, time travelers, interesting idea, taken very seriously by a credentialed academic. You have people like Andrew Gallimore. Dr. Gallimore is a proponent of the use of psychedelics like dimethyltryptamine, or in other words, DMT, that's been utilized for centuries by Amazonian shamanic cultures for the purpose of journeys or medicinal use. It's been sort of modernized now, but he advocates and actually promotes this project by the Imperial College of London called DMTX, where they're administering dimethyltryptamine intravenously to people who are taking what we call extended journeys, which sends them into a dreamlike state that's very illusory, but some people would say is more real than reality, in which they can do what they're able to map out the DMT realms and their encounters, what we call the entities, sometimes referred to as machine elves. So there is an interplay between the perception of people who have out-of-body experiences, in non-physical consciousness, augmented states of reality with the utilization of psychedelic substances, conducted and facilitated by a very prestigious university in a very serious way. And the entities encountered in such experiences are not dissimilar to those within the UFO stories. So I was in a documentary called As Within, So Without, From UFOs to DMT, that helps to make these and draw these correlations as well. Ray Hernandez, who's a part of the Consciousness and Contact Research Institute, was originally part of the study called Free Study that was headed up by Dr. Edgar Mitchell, former Apollo astronaut. The Free Study basically was a medical statistical analysis of nearly 4,000 people who described having entity encounters. Overall, they described the study as giving the impression that most encounters were of positive nature and not negative nature, to insinuate that the things that we hear about negative experiences are actually a minority, according to this statistical study called Free by the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences. It's a lot. Also part of that study was Dr. Joseph Burks, and he also worked with Dr. Greer for a while, but no longer. He comes up with what he calls the virtual experience model to help kind of explain some of these very odd and unusual phenomena. Other academic interests, you have Dr. Jeffrey Kripal over here at Rice University in Houston, Texas. They have very seriously moved into looking into all manner of unusual and extraordinary phenomena, from parapsychology to UFOs and beyond, and they now house what they call the Archives of the Impossible, where they've brought in several prestigious speakers such as Jacques Vallée, Diana Pasulka, Willie Strieber, who's, many people know, the author of Communion with the alien gray face on the front. That itself is actually a gateway for people all over the world to learn about this. They see that book years ago, and it helped to kind of bridge the gap. Well, he describes having those experiences in San Antonio. He no longer lives there, but that's a big part about the relation. This is actually an ongoing event. They're going to have another event there in April. So they're going to do what they can to bring people in to talk about these topics with interesting people. I think this year's theme is also UFOs. What does religion have to say about UFOs? There's so many things. People interpret things differently, but I just wanted to include that I talked with L.A. Marzulli, who has a series called The Watchers, and his interpretation is that we're dealing with an issue of demonic nature, and that we need to be careful about what we're doing, because it could be inviting things in. That's his interpretation, and many people's actually, of a standpoint within a religious ideology. Well, along those lines, there are various mystical and wisdom traditions that people draw upon. What about the native perspectives? People like the late Clifford Mahudi, who's a medicine man, the Zuni elder, and talks about the star people, and that the ways that they interpret these things are a little bit also kind of interact with the same types of ideas that that we glean knowledge, that there's an imparting of knowledge from the star people who are not from here. And people like John Dover and Stanley Milford Jr. of the Navajo Rangers, they call themselves the Parallel Rangers. They look into all kinds of very strange things that they're called out on from law enforcement perspective, and they go out on business to try to conduct this. Here we are, we had this event called the Sky Dancer Native UFO Conference here in Houston. I don't know if this is going to happen anymore, but a cool alteration for a theme outside of just the basic UFO nuts and bolts perspective. You have like a more culturally relevant perspectives, and so I like this event. It would be cool to have something happen again. Are there objects related to UFOs? Well, yes, obviously people see the object, but are things left? Are there remnants? Is there debris? Well, for sure. Frank Himmler is a geologist, and he's found many times some pieces of metal out in the debris field in north of Roswell, which has been tested, has been featured on shows, looked into. So this is interesting because the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, is interested in his findings. They own that land, or at least did for a long time. Just some other notable mentions, other than like inorganic material, there seems to be organic material associated with this subject as a tangent. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Star Child Skull before? So it's an interesting relic that unfortunately was touted around for a long time in a way that probably was a little bit irresponsible. Without really knowing about it, though, it's something that we're glad to find out after the fact. I actually got to hold the real thing at an event over in Lubbock, Texas, which wasn't about aliens really at all, but the owner at the time, Melanie Young, was showing this and was just about to do a study with Chase Klutsky, who used to be part of MUFON's STAR team, and other people to conduct an osteological analysis to see what the real origins of this Star Child skull were. They determined that the nuclear DNA was Native American and the maternal DNA was like South American. This was found in a cave in Mexico. It's dated to be about 900 years old. It was found next to a normal, ordinary human skull. You can see due to its misshapen form that people considered maybe like the late boy Pye thought this was an alien or alien hybrid. Turns out that according to this study, that it's not alien in any way, and it was just someone who was malformed, something like progeria, which you can see maybe makes some sense. And it makes us wonder, okay, but ancient people, even though that's not super ancient, we don't know that. So we as a group of people in different communities have a way that we interpret things if they're malformed. If people look certain ways, we assume things sometimes, and it's hard for us to really know what's going on if people are just born a certain way. So it's interesting to think about the cultural relevance throughout history when we have something like this happen. And so another small specimen is the Atacama skeleton. Now this is not the real specimen, I would never hold it this way. But it's gotten a lot of attention. It was analyzed. Dr. Gary Nolan looked at it, and he determined apparently that it is also not alien in any way. It's totally human, according to him. On the contrary, Dr. Stephen Greer says this is the real deal. So again, very continuing viewpoints over historic mysteries, just like what we're seeing now with the Nazca mummies. I've met with Jaime Maussan, who you guys have probably seen on TV. He basically is a driving force of interest when it comes to like the pop culture aspect and community. But another thing is that they're bringing out these bodies for people to examine and look at. At least they had something to show, whereas our congressional hearings in the U.S. didn't have anything to show. They just had talking heads. So one interesting note. One interesting note is that Neil deGrasse Tyson, scientist, had made the comment saying that, well, at least in the Mexican display of those bodies, I think people said it was at Mexican Congress. I think it was something similar or affiliated, but not actually the Mexican Congress. Whatever it was, they said that at least along with the claims they made, they showed something. Whether they're real or not, at least they had something to show people, here they are. Whereas in the U.S. congressional hearings, they said, we've got aliens, we've got technology, or whatever they said, and that was that. That was all it was, right? So at least following the claims, they had something to show, to be determined. Well, when it comes to that, what can we understand when science can help us understand like all these other things in our life? What can it do for the subject of UFOs, right? So people like Michio Kaku have been proponents in different ways and in varying capacities. When I first saw him, he kind of jokingly laughed off saying, we don't have a UFO on a hangar in Area 51. We don't have that. As just a very kind of lighthearted throwaway joke in his talk on the future of physics. And since the advent of that article about the New York Times and the Tic Tac and all that, he has completely turned around and said, these are real things in the military, who's got the best resources and equipment in the world to do this stuff. If they're saying that we have this stuff going on, then we need to take this seriously. So he's kind of gone not just 180, but very much into a, I think, more considerable direction than just being a debunker, some would say. People like Dr. Seth Shostak of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, or SETI, which was once part of NASA, shares about the utilization of the deep space detection of these signals. They're not trying to communicate with aliens, they're trying to listen and to see if they can find any signals or anything that's relevant to some kind of artificial manufacturing. I also talked with Dr. Avi Loeb about the Galileo project and their efforts toward understanding UAP, as well as the understanding of other interstellar objects like Oumuamua, which he described and has been kind of ridiculed for suggesting that it was extraterrestrial technology. So it's interesting to see that, and he's totally backed by Harvard. He's been a chair of their astronomy department. they're giving him some leeway. This is very interesting scene in the academic realm. And of course, Dr. Gary Nolan, Stanford School of Medicine, he's studied more samples than probably anyone publicly known. And, so it's interesting to see what will come from some of the things he's doing, along with people like Dr. Eric Davis, who's been involved with defense contracting, and people like Eric Davis and then Hal Puthoff have worked with Robert Bigelow, the National Institute for Discovery Sciences, or NIDS. They worked on ATIP. These people are highly credentialed and probably know more than so many other people, but they're obligated to security oaths, and they can't just spill the beans, and they have consequences. So these guys are here in Texas, and they probably know so much, at least Eric Davis is. So are there organizations? Well, absolutely. CERO, the Close Encounter Research Organization with Yvonne Smith. OPUS, the Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support with Leslie Velez, who used to be part of MUFON. UAP Med with Ted Rowe. The Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies with Robert Powell, who used to be part of MUFON. Soul Foundation, which is sort of a new up-and-coming endeavor with Gary Nolan. Enigma Labs, who Alejandro Rojas was a part of as well. MUFON, of course, Mutual UFO Network. That's one of the hosts of our event here today as well. With I've met a number of times, and we live in the same area as well. Director of Investigations, Steve Hudgens. And are there events about UFOs? Yeah, well, here's one we're at right now, but in addition to that, there are all these other conferences and things all over. The Ozarks Mountain UFO Conference, my buddy, Jim Mars, got to present there. We were there in 2016. It's still going. Of course, you can go see Ancient Aliens Live if you're interested in that sort of thing. You can go to Contact in the Desert, one of the largest events. It's like considered the Woodstock of UFOs. The Roswell UFO Festival, one of the coolest things that I think anyone can go do is go check out Roswell if you get to the festival or not. Within the festival, there's also the newspaper, the Roswell Daily Records event called the Roswell Incident. I've been able to host the event there. We had an Ancient Aliens panel and some cool stuff going on. And of course, the museum hosted their own event called the UFOlogist Invasion. Pretty fun. Definitely check out the museum if you've never been before as well. And other fun places that have some interesting history, like the Point Pleasant, West Virginia has the Mothman Festival. Huge event, like comparable to Roswell. Thousands of people. It's great. And of course, MUFON has their annual symposium, an international symposium. I was a presenter at the one last year in Irving, Texas, and was fortunate to take part on a really cool panel with Geraldine here and Chanel and Earl Gray. Geraldine is a family member of the interesting events that took place in Hopkinsville, the Hopkinsville Goblins, if you ever heard of that one. And then Chanel is the granddaughter of Kenneth Arnold. So pretty cool. She kind of told about that legacy. Of course, we're going to have this event later on this year in Jefferson, Texas, the Texas UFO Conference. This is going to be our fourth one. And then, of course, probably my favorite out of all of them is the Edinburgh UFO Festival Conference. And I'm a little bit, partial just because I've been coming. It's great, but it's like, thanks to Noe for helping to help get the word out and having the city really realize the importance of community involvement. Like it's been so well structured and put together. I'm hopeful that we can keep track of the developments to see. It's just like over a decade running, longest running event on UFOs in Texas, one of the best and biggest UFO events in the world, I would say, after all the ones I've been to. So as a comparative analysis to a lot of other fields of study, it's really interesting, but I would say kind of as a conclusion to the idea of UFOlogy ethnography, a cultural study, the people, the outlooks, the groups, the things, places, all of these things. There's so much that we can understand, that we can interpret, we can assume, but in doing that, it's important to see the relevance. What's the functionality of all of this as well? How do we move forward and try to understand things in a way that's constructive in reality, right? So I would say that it helps give us a framework for all the other interesting areas of anomalous events, whether that's going to be paranormal, or it's going to be out of body, whatever it is that there are many different interests in. I think that it helps to give a framework for the same way we have a close encounter system, the Hynek scale. But what I found out is that in all of these different circles, that you have people attempting to interface with something from beyond. The methods and techniques through which that is conducted or facilitated varies, and there's no consistent one. I think that that's the thing right now, is that people are attempting to do things. Whether it's CE5 or they're going out on a haunted location and trying to use EVPs or trying to call out the spirits, whether you're on a cryptid investigation, and you're attempting to elicit responses from unknown creatures, everyone is attempting to, or many people are trying to do something to elicit responses from something non-human. That's a commonality. Well, we need to consider what is the media, government, military involvement, as well as science, and all these things that we talked about. The anthropological implications are vast, and I think it's important to see that this idea that things will just be disclosed to us all at once, I find extremely unlikely. I think that people say, we are the disclosure, to me is not really the case. I think that's called social activism. It's called being proactive with something you're into, and that's great, but I don't think that's disclosure, because to me, that means you're deliberately revealing something which has been actively concealed for years. And it would be amazing if that could happen, but I'm not holding my breath. And this idea that we can make contact and meet Zeno and his buddies and his family, right? So the resources are out there for us to be able to maintain connection between these topics in a way that we can be actively involved. I put together a network called the Texas UFO Network. It's something you can go to online and be able to see what's going on with reports, news, videos, events, and all that sort of stuff. You can also see a lot of the media that I've shared on the Vortex, which is my YouTube channel and media platform, to be able to talk about all these different interesting topics as well, and how we can stay connected as well. So with that, we're going to stop this part and take a break. If there are any questions, we can kind of get into that as well. And I just want to appreciate everyone being here for the first segment of our seminar, UFOlogy Ethnography. Thank you.